December 5th, 1943. The dense jungles of Bougainville Island trembled under a torrential downpour as Sergeant Frank Mercer of the 3rd Marine Division crouched behind a fallen palm tree, his Thompson submachine gun clutched against his chest. Water streamed down the weapon's steel frame, pooling in every crevice and joint. Around him, his squad prepared for what intelligence promised would be a routine patrol through supposedly cleared territory. They believed their weapons would function flawlessly when needed, just as they had during countless training exercises back in California. They had no idea how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove to be within the next 30 minutes. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these Marines understood yet was that their trusted Thompson guns harbored a fatal flaw that would transform routine engagements into desperate struggles for survival, until one man's improvised solution, using nothing more than a discarded bootlace, would revolutionize close-quarters combat and save countless lives across every theater of the war. Sergeant Mercer had carried his Thompson since landing on Guadalcanal 14 months earlier. The weapon, officially designated the M1928A1, weighed 10 pounds fully loaded and fired 450 caliber automatic pistol rounds per minute. To Mercer, it represented American industrial might condensed into 33 inches of walnut and steel. He had named it Betty after his sister back in Pittsburgh, and he trusted it with his life. The Thompson had earned legendary status even before America entered the conflict. Designed by General John Thompson in 1918, it was intended to be a trench broom for the Great War. By the time it reached production, that conflict had ended, but the weapon found eager customers among law enforcement and, notoriously, criminal organizations during Prohibition. Now, with war consuming the globe, the Auto Ordnance Corporation was producing 15,000 units monthly at their Bridgeport facility, struggling to meet military demand. But there was a problem that neither the designers nor the procurement officers had fully appreciated until weapons reached combat conditions. The Thompson's drum magazine, whether the 50-round or 75-round variant, was held in place by a simple spring-loaded catch mechanism. On firing ranges in temperate climates with clean weapons and fresh magazines, this system worked adequately. In the jungles of the Pacific, the swamps of Italy, or the hedgerows of France, it became a catastrophic liability. Private Danny Chen, Mercer's assistant gunner, had witnessed the problem firsthand 3 weeks earlier during an engagement near the Coromira River. His Thompson's magazine had simply fallen away mid-burst, tumbling into the mud as enemy soldiers advanced. Chen had survived only because Corporal James Washington provided covering fire while Chen frantically retrieved and reseated the magazine. The incident had shaken Chen badly. He had begun taping his magazines in place before patrols, but the tropical humidity defeated even military-grade adhesive within hours. The patrol moved deeper into the jungle that morning, with Mercer's squad forming the vanguard of a company-sized reconnaissance operation. Lieutenant Robert Hammond, a former engineering student from Michigan, led the formation. Hammond had studied the after-action reports coming from other units, and the pattern disturbed him. Across the Pacific Theater, Thompson gunners were reporting magazine failures at an alarming rate. Some estimates suggested that up to 90% of weapon malfunctions involved magazine retention rather than actual mechanical failure of the firing mechanism. The numbers told a grim story. A survey conducted by ordnance officers in November 1943 across 3 Marine divisions revealed that Thompson gunners experienced magazine detachment during 63% of engagements lasting more than 2 minutes. In conditions involving rain, mud, or physical contact with vegetation, that number climbed to 78%. Considering that close-quarters combat rarely lasted more than 90 seconds, this meant Thompson gunners were effectively operating single-shot weapons for much of any extended engagement. The Japanese forces defending Bougainville understood this vulnerability. Captured documents later revealed that soldiers were specifically instructed to engage American submachine gunners in prolonged exchanges, waiting for the inevitable weapon failure before pressing attacks. It was a tactical doctrine born from observed American equipment limitations rather than Japanese numerical or technological superiority. Mercer's squad reached a small clearing around 1000 hours. The rain had intensified, transforming the jungle floor into an ankle-deep morass of mud and decomposing vegetation. Visibility extended perhaps 20 yards in any direction. Mercer signaled for the squad to halt while he consulted his map, trying to correlate their position with Lieutenant Hammond's intended route. That was when Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, walking point, spotted movement through the foliage. The engagement erupted with shocking suddenness. Kowalski opened fire with his M1 Garand rifle, the distinctive ping of the semi-automatic weapon cutting through the rain's white noise. Immediately, answering fire came from multiple positions, and Mercer realized with cold clarity that they had walked into a prepared ambush. The routine patrol had just become a fight for survival. Mercer brought his Thompson up, thumbing off the safety as he acquired a target through the weapon's simple blade front sight. He squeezed the trigger and felt the familiar bucking recoil as the submachine gun spat rounds downrange. 3 seconds into the burst, he felt the sickening sensation of the weapon's balance shifting. The 50-round drum magazine had detached, falling away even as his finger remained on the trigger. The Thompson clicked empty, its bolt locked back on a non-existent round. Around him, 3 other Marines armed with Thompson guns experienced identical failures within the first 10 seconds of contact. Private Chen's weapon lost its magazine during his opening burst. Corporal Washington managed 15 rounds before his drum tumbled free. Private Mickey Sullivan didn't even get a shot off before his magazine, loosened by the morning's movement through dense vegetation, simply fell away when he raised the weapon to fire. The mathematical reality of the situation was brutally simple. Mercer's 9-man squad had been armed with 4 Thompson submachine guns, 3 M1 Garand rifles, 1 Browning automatic rifle, and 1 M1911 pistol carried by Lieutenant Hammond. Within seconds of contact, their close-range firepower had been reduced by roughly 45%. The Japanese ambush party, estimated at 15 to 20 soldiers, had anticipated exactly this development. Mercer dropped behind a rotting log, yanking the Thompson's bolt back and locking it to the rear. His fingers fumbled with the detached drum magazine, trying to reseat it in the weapon's magazine well, while incoming rounds chewed bark and wood splinters from his cover. The drum magazine's circular profile made it difficult to align properly under stress. The retention catch, a simple spring-loaded mechanism perhaps 2 inches long, required precise alignment to engage. In laboratory conditions, magazine changes could be accomplished in 4 to 5 seconds by trained personnel. Here, with hands slick from rain and adrenaline-degrading fine motor control, Mercer needed nearly 20 seconds to get the weapon functioning again. Those 20 seconds felt like 20 hours. Mercer watched Private Sullivan take a round through the shoulder while attempting to reload his Thompson. Corporal Washington, having successfully reseated his magazine, fired another burst before the drum detached again, this time falling directly into a water-filled shell crater where it sank from view. Washington transitioned to his pistol, but the M1911's 7-round magazine and relatively modest stopping power made it a poor substitute for a submachine gun's volume of fire. Lieutenant Hammond crawled to Mercer's position, his uniform caked in mud and forest debris. Hammond's face was pale but controlled. He had been in the Corps less than 9 months, but he understood infantry combat with the clarity that separates survivors from casualties. Then Hammond said something that would change everything. "You know what we need," Hammond observed, his voice barely audible over the ongoing firefight. "Some way to keep those drums attached. Something simple, something that works even when everything else goes to hell." Mercer nodded, firing a carefully aimed burst at a muzzle flash visible through the undergrowth. This time he kept one hand firmly pressed against the drum magazine's base, physically preventing it from detaching. The technique worked, but reduced his ability to control the weapon and made it impossible to use cover effectively. The engagement lasted another 40 minutes before Japanese forces withdrew. Mercer's squad had expended nearly 600 rounds of ammunition, but estimated they had inflicted perhaps 3 casualties. The disparity reflected not poor marksmanship, but rather the constant struggle to keep weapons functioning under combat conditions. The Marines had spent more time reloading and clearing malfunctions than actually shooting. That evening, back at the company perimeter, Lieutenant Hammond gathered every Thompson gunner in the unit. 23 Marines assembled in a makeshift shelter, constructed from ponchos and salvaged timber. The air smelled of gun oil, wet canvas, and the peculiar mustiness that defined the South Pacific's jungle environment. Hammond had brought a Thompson disassembled into its major components: the receiver, barrel assembly, bolt, and crucially, the drum magazine and its retention mechanism. He spread these parts on a shelter half, creating an impromptu classroom. "Gentlemen," Hammond began, "we have a problem that's getting Marines hurt. Our Thompsons are failing not because they're poorly made, but because they're being used in conditions the designers never anticipated. We need a solution, and we need it now. I don't care if it's officially approved or if it appears in any manual. I care if it works." The assembled Marines stared at the disassembled weapon. Most had experienced magazine retention failures. All had watched squadmates struggle with the same issue. The Thompson was beloved for its firepower and reliability in feeding ammunition, but that reliability meant nothing if the magazine detached before the weapon could empty it. Sergeant Bill Mackenzie, a Thompson gunner from 2nd Squad, voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sir, we've tried tape, wire, even rubber bands cut from inner tubes. Nothing holds up to sustained use. The humidity defeats adhesives. Wire damages the retention mechanism. Rubber degrades in days under these conditions." Hammond nodded. "I know, that's why we need to think differently. The magazine needs to be physically secured to the weapon in a way that doesn't interfere with magazine changes, but prevents accidental detachment. Something adjustable. Something that can be rapidly released when necessary, but stays tight during use." The discussion continued for 30 minutes, with various Marines proposing and debating solutions. Some suggested modifying the retention catch itself, but none of the squad had machining equipment or replacement parts if modifications went wrong. Others proposed external clamps or brackets, but these would add weight and complexity. Then Private Chen spoke up. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but his words would echo through every combat theater before the war's end. "What about a bootlace?" Chen suggested. "Thread it through the drum magazine's cooling slots, wrap it around the Thompson's barrel shroud, and tie it with a quick release knot. Tight enough to prevent detachment, but loose enough to allow magazine changes when you untie it." The shelter fell silent. Every Marine there had bootlaces. Every Thompson's drum magazine had cooling slots designed to dissipate heat. Every Thompson's barrel was surrounded by a finned shroud that would provide anchor points for a lace. Hammond picked up the drum magazine, examining its perforated steel construction. The cooling slots, designed to allow air circulation and prevent overheating during sustained fire, formed a regular pattern around the drum's circumference. A standard bootlace could easily thread through these openings. The lieutenant looked at Chen with something approaching wonder. "Private, that might be the most tactically significant suggestion I've heard since landing in the Pacific. Let's test it immediately." Within minutes, Chen had removed a lace from his boondocker boots and was demonstrating his concept. He threaded the lace through 2 cooling slots on opposite sides of the drum magazine, then wrapped both ends around the Thompson's barrel shroud, securing them with a bow knot positioned where it wouldn't interfere with the weapon's sights or operating handle. The result looked crude, almost comical. A mud-stained cotton bootlace securing a 10-pound submachine gun's magazine seemed like the sort of improvised field repair that would never survive contact with combat conditions. But when Hammond picked up the weapon and shook it vigorously, the magazine remained solidly attached. When he simulated the jarring impact of running through jungle terrain, the magazine didn't budge. When he attempted to deliberately dislodge the magazine through the sort of contact with vegetation that routinely caused failures, the bootlace held firm. The testing continued for 2 hours, growing progressively more aggressive. Hammond fired the weapon, then checked the lace for heat damage. The cotton showed some singing where it contacted the barrel shroud, but the material's thickness prevented burn-through. Chen demonstrated magazine changes, untying the bow knot, removing the drum, seating a fresh magazine, and retying the lace in under 15 seconds. With practice, he got the time down to 12 seconds. By midnight, every Thompson in the company had been modified with the bootlace system. Marines scavenged laces from spare boots, borrowed them from corpsmen and engineers, and in some cases fashioned improvised substitutes from parachute cord and tent rope. The modifications cost nothing, required no special tools, and could be implemented by any soldier in any environment. The true test came 3 days later during a company assault on a fortified position near the Piva River. Mercer's squad led the advance, with all 4 Thompson gunners employing the Bootlace modification. The engagement lasted 18 minutes and involved sustained close-quarters combat through dense jungle and prepared defensive positions. Not a single Thompson experienced magazine failure throughout the entire engagement. Mercer emptied his 50-round drum twice, performing magazine changes under fire without incident. The Bootlace system held the drums solidly in place during movement and firing, but released cleanly when he needed to reload. Private Chen, whose weapon had failed during the previous engagement, fired 3 full magazines without malfunction. Corporal Washington, who had lost a drum magazine in a water-filled crater during the earlier ambush, maintained continuous fire throughout a 30-second burst that expended 48 rounds. The difference was transformative. With reliable weapons, the squad's Thompson gunners provided sustained suppressive fire that allowed riflemen to maneuver. The volume of fire increased dramatically, as gunners no longer needed to physically hold magazines in place or constantly stop to reseat detached drums. The psychological impact on friendly forces was equally significant. Marines who had begun to distrust their primary close-quarters weapon now approached engagements with restored confidence. Word of the modification spread through the 3rd Marine Division within days. Within 2 weeks, it had reached adjacent Army units fighting on Bougainville. By January 1944, the Bootlace modification was being implemented across the Pacific theater. Marines, soldiers, and Coast Guardsmen serving in island campaigns adopted the technique enthusiastically. No official directive mandated its use, no technical manual documented the procedure, but the modification proliferated through the most effective distribution system in any military: word of mouth between combat troops. The technique reached Europe through returning wounded and replacement personnel who had trained with Pacific veterans. By March 1944, American forces preparing for the Normandy invasion were implementing the Bootlace modification as standard procedure. When paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into France on June 6th, many carried Thompson guns secured with bootlaces. Technical analysis conducted by Army Ordnance Corps officers in April 1944 confirmed what frontline troops already knew. Thompson submachine guns employing the Bootlace modification experienced magazine retention failures at a rate of 3% compared to 63% for unmodified weapons. The improvement represented a roughly 90% reduction in malfunction rates. The study's authors noted that this improvement came at zero cost in materials or manufacturing time and required no modifications to existing weapon stocks. The broader implications extended beyond simple reliability statistics. American infantry doctrine in the Second World War emphasized fire superiority and maneuver. Squads were built around complementary weapon systems: rifles for precision fire, automatic rifles for sustained fire, and submachine guns for close-quarters firepower. When Thompson guns malfunctioned at high rates, entire tactical formations became unbalanced. Restoring Thompson reliability through the Bootlace modification allowed squads to function as designed, maximizing their combined arms effectiveness. Consider the mathematical impact on combat power. A standard Marine rifle squad in 1944 consisted of 13 men armed with a mix of rifles, automatic weapons and submachine guns. If 4 of those Marines carried Thompson guns experiencing 63% malfunction rates, the squad's effective close-quarters firepower was reduced by roughly 1/4 at any given moment. The Bootlace modification, reducing malfunctions to 3%, restored that missing firepower. Across a battalion of roughly 900 infantrymen, this translated to the equivalent of adding an entire rifle company's worth of reliable automatic weapons. The modification also had unexpected effects on ammunition logistics. Thompson gunners who trusted their weapons to function reliably used ammunition more efficiently, firing aimed bursts rather than frantically emptying magazines during the brief periods when their weapons worked. This reduced ammunition consumption by an estimated 15 to 20%. while maintaining equivalent suppressive effect. For military planners managing supply chains stretching thousands of miles across oceans, this efficiency gain was nearly as valuable as the improved reliability itself. Private Chen, whose suggestion had sparked the modification, received no formal recognition for his contribution. The Marine Corps award system, like most military bureaucracies, was designed to recognize valor in combat rather than tactical innovation. Chen survived the war, returning to his family's restaurant in San Francisco in December 1945. He rarely spoke about his service and never mentioned the Bootlace modification. When asked about his war experience, he would typically shrug and note that he had done his job like everyone else. But across the Pacific and European theaters, thousands of soldiers and Marines were implementing Chen's innovation daily. The modification became so ubiquitous that many troops assumed it was official procedure, unaware that no military manual mentioned bootlaces and that the technique had originated from a private's improvised solution to a life-threatening equipment failure. The modification even influenced post-war weapon design. When the Army began developing replacements for the Thompson in the late 1940s, ordnance engineers specifically examined why the Bootlace modification had proven necessary. This analysis contributed to improved magazine retention systems in subsequent submachine gun designs, including the M3 grease gun that eventually replaced the Thompson in American service. The fundamental lesson that magazine retention was as critical as feeding reliability became a core principle in automatic weapons design. Lieutenant Hammond, who had facilitated the modification's testing and implementation, advanced through the ranks to become a captain by war's end. He survived campaigns across the Pacific, always carrying a Thompson secured with a bootlace. After the war, Hammond returned to Michigan and completed his engineering degree. He spent 30 years designing industrial equipment, but he kept a Thompson drum magazine on his desk, bootlace still threaded through the cooling slots, as a reminder that elegant solutions often come from unexpected sources. Sergeant Mercer also survived the war, though not without cost. He was wounded twice more before the Japanese surrender, once during the Guam campaign and again on Okinawa. He carried Betty, his Thompson submachine gun, through every engagement. The bootlace securing its magazine was replaced dozens of times as cotton wore through from heat and abrasion, but the modification itself never failed. When Mercer finally returned to Pittsburgh in October 1945, he brought the Thompson home with him, carefully disassembled and packed in his sea bag. It hung over his fireplace for 40 years, bootlace still in place, a tangible reminder of how small innovations can have large consequences. The broader story of the Thompson submachine gun in the Second World War is well documented. Over 1,400,000 units were produced during the conflict. The weapon served in every theater, employed by American, British, Soviet, and numerous Allied forces. Its distinctive profile and mechanical reliability made it an iconic symbol of Allied firepower, but the weapon's effectiveness in combat depended on countless small factors, and the bootlace modification addressed one of the most significant. This pattern of combat troops identifying and solving equipment problems through improvised modifications repeated throughout the war across all armies and nations. Soldiers welded additional armor to vulnerable vehicles, modified uniforms for specific climatic conditions, and adapted weapons to roles their designers never envisioned. Military historians often focus on grand strategy and major technological developments, but wars are won through accumulation of countless small advantages. The bootlace modification represented exactly this type of advantage: simple, cheap, universally applicable, and profoundly effective. The modification also illustrated important principles about innovation under pressure. Chen's solution worked not because it was technologically sophisticated, but because it directly addressed the specific failure mode affecting Thompson guns in combat conditions. He didn't attempt to redesign the weapon or develop complex retention mechanisms. He used available materials to solve an immediate problem. This pragmatic approach, common among frontline troops, often produced more effective results than elaborate engineering solutions developed far from combat. There is also something profoundly democratic about the bootlace modification's origin and spread. It didn't come from ordnance experts or weapon designers. It came from a private in a rifle squad who had nearly been overwhelmed when his weapon failed. It spread not through official directives, but through troops sharing information with each other, recognizing a good idea when they saw it. In an organization as hierarchical as the military, the rapid adoption of a private's suggestion represented a kind of meritocracy, where effectiveness trumped rank or formal authority. By the war's end, the Bootlace modification had become so standard that armories issuing Thompson guns often included a length of bootlace with each weapon, though this practice was never officially mandated. Training films produced in late 1944 and early 1945 sometimes showed the modification, though usually without explaining its origin or noting that it represented unofficial procedure. To new troops entering service in the war's final year, the bootlace was simply how Thompson guns were set up, as standard as the weapon's sling or cleaning kit. The modification's legacy extended into subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, remaining Thompson guns in American service continued to employ bootlace retention, though by this time the practice had been formalized in field manuals. Some soldiers who had served in the Second World War even applied similar techniques to other weapons, threading cord or wire through any equipment that showed tendency to detach under field conditions. The underlying principle, that simple physical retention often outperforms complex mechanical mechanisms in harsh conditions, became part of informal military wisdom passed between generations of combat troops. Today, the Thompson submachine gun occupies an honored place in military history museums and private collections. Restored examples typically feature period-correct accessories and configurations. Many collectors and historians who maintain functional Thompsons have rediscovered the bootlace modification through period photographs and veteran accounts. Some implement it on their own weapons, not out of necessity, but as an authentic detail reflecting how these guns were actually employed in combat. The contrast between the Thompson's cultural image and its combat reality remains striking. Popular culture often portrays the weapon as perfectly reliable, an extension of American industrial power that functioned flawlessly in any conditions. The historical reality was more complex. The Thompson was a robust and effective weapon, but it had vulnerabilities that combat conditions exposed. The bootlace modification didn't diminish the weapon's reputation, but rather demonstrated the adaptability and problem-solving ability of the troops who carried it. This adaptability represented its own form of technological superiority. While the Thompson's German and Japanese equivalents may have had different strengths and weaknesses, American forces possessed systematic advantages in training, resources, and organizational culture that encouraged innovation from all ranks. The bootlace modification exemplified these advantages. A private could identify a problem, propose a solution, and see it implemented across entire theaters within weeks. This responsiveness, this willingness to embrace good ideas regardless of their source, was as important as any material advantage. The human dimension of this story deserves emphasis. Private Chen's suggestions saved lives, not in the dramatic fashion of battlefield heroism, but through the accumulation of small advantages that kept weapons functioning when soldiers needed them most. Sergeant Mercer survived partially because his Thompson didn't fail at critical moments. Lieutenant Hammond's squad maintained combat effectiveness because their weapons remained reliable. Multiply these individual cases across thousands of engagements, and the bootlace modification's contribution becomes clear. It was a life-saving innovation that cost nothing and required only the willingness to try something new. There is poetry in the solution's simplicity. A bootlace, one of the most basic items in any soldier's equipment, solving a problem that sophisticated mechanical engineering had failed to prevent. It speaks to the resourcefulness of common soldiers, to the value of practical experience over theoretical design, and to the importance of staying open to simple solutions, even when addressing complex problems. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.